Okay, so my name is Jaimie, and I'm going to be talking about Margaret Sanger, the sex education pioneer, and that why she became to know that. Uh, she is surrounded by a lot of controversy as to why she was so interested in birth control and whatnot. But Carissa's going to delve into that a little later on, so let's just go ahead and get started. First things first, let's try to get some historical context so we can maybe understand Margaret Sanger's plight a little bit better. During this time, uh, you'll see in Margaret Sanger a lot of her, run-ins are happening during the same time as women's suffrage, which is obviously women trying to get a lot of their rights, including their right to vote, which actually wasn't a thing until 1920. So that's the first major modern shift that we see that resembles America like it is today. And that happened in the early part of the 19th century. Yeah. Margaret Sanger, however, started getting in trouble sometime around 1910, looking to defend women's rights. So went a little bit further than just the right to vote. She thought women had the right to themselves. And initially, when she started out, a lot of the things that she was trying to do were illegal. But I will say, surprisingly, the way that she was trying to distribute information about birth control did become legal in 1918, which I would not have saw coming. And then we have a woman named Emma Goldman. Emma Goldman is a tough lady. She is characterized as a political activist, which I think is funny because she's an anarchist. She had a lot of social issues she was interested in, but one of those things she was interested in was women's rights and their right to birth control. In 1893, she was arrested for inciting riots. She was not inciting riots. She was handing out information about birth control, and the police did not like that. She became so much, people didn't like her. So it wasn't that hard to try to link her to the assassination of President McKinley in 1901, when really what had happened was that she had met the actual assassin earlier at some point. He had tried to become her friend. She said she wasn't interested. They go off their separate ways. But all people remember is that they saw them talking. So she's telling the police, no, I didn't have any part of this, no thank you. And even, the man responsible is telling the police, no, that's not what happened. She had nothing to do with it, long story short, she ends up not going to jail for conspiracy to assassinate the president, and she ended up teaming up with Margaret Sanger in 1914, and they actually worked together for a really long time. So that's some context about where we are in America right then, which brings us to the Comstock Laws. And that was essentially a broad term, meaning that you couldn't distribute or mail anything remotely sexual. And that meant that you couldn't send out contraceptives, any equipment to perform an abortion or anything like that, like toys, which I didn't think was a thing then, or basically anything that could be deemed obscene, which a lot of the times meant information about birth control or family limitation planning. So you couldn't do that, or you would be jailed. And in 1909, they added Section 245 to that law that said that not only could you not do it through the Postal Service, you also couldn't do it through the railroad service, which, again, if you're thinking about this time, what other options did they really have, So obviously, we would not be talking about Margaret Sanger if she had just laid down and taken that. So here we are. She thought these laws were ridiculous, and she wanted women to have as much information as they could, So she saw people suffering around her, People were having unwanted pregnancies. They were having unsafe abortions and miscarriages and stuff, and she really wanted to ratify that. And she's famously quoted as saying every child should be a wanted child, which is true. So she released her first book in 1914. It was called Family Limitation, which, guess what? didn't go over very well, and she fled the country to avoid that arrest. She didn't stay gone long. She came back, opened her first clinic in 1916, and was arrested for that one. She wasn't, I don't believe she was jailed for too long. Yeah, she got out of jail, went back to what she was doing. And then, before we know it, we have what we have known today as Planned Parenthood. And Planned Parenthood is still very controversial to this day. It's a lifesaver for a lot of people, though. It's still around today. A lot of people don't like it because it is loosely, or not loosely, associated with abortion, which abortions weren't even performed at Planned Parenthood until 1970, and even still, they aren't, performed at every Planned Parenthood today. But that's just a little bit on a soapbox there. Originally opened in 1921, was originally called the American Birth Control League. Obviously saw a lot of changes and obstacles in the meantime, which is why Sanger got really involved in lobbying. She formed the National Committee on Federal Legislation for Birth Control in 1929. And I mean, she worked tirelessly through the decades. Like you're seeing a gap in numbers on this slide, but she worked the whole time. She ended up making it to the president of Planned Parenthood from 52 to 59. She retired in 59, and I believe she died 5 or 6 years after that. So she worked most of her life, and she worked a lot for women's rights, and then we're going to move on. So that was Margaret Sanger, sex education pioneer.
Hey guys, I'm Madison Frisbee. I'm going to be talking about Margaret Sanger and her advocacy for contraception and what she advocated for specifically. And I'm also going to be touching up on a woman named Dorothea Dix and her contribution towards women's mental health care and her participation in politics in the 1800s. So Margaret Sanger began her journey for researching how to create this magic pill once she was forced to flee to England. So while she was there, she worked on and researched other means of controlling pregnancy, including diaphragms. She moved back to the United States a year later after her charges had been dropped, and she started touring to promote birth control, the phrase that she in fact coined. In 1916, she opened her first birth control clinic in the United States, but 9 days after the clinic opened, her and her staff were arrested, and they were charged for giving women information about contraception and for fitting women for diaphragms. So they were in jail for 30 days for breaking the Comstock Law. But the fight paid off because later they appealed her conviction and made it possible for doctors to give women information regarding means of controlling pregnancy, and they were able to now prescribe birth control for medical reasons. It was a huge step towards the birth control movement and towards women's rights. 5 years after that happened, Margaret Sanger founded and she became the president of the American Birth Control League, which is now today's Planned Parenthood Federation of America. In 1923, she finally opened the first legal birth control clinic in the United States. It was called the Birth Control Clinical Research Bureau. So she still wanted to accomplish more for contraception rights, so she started the National Committee on Federal Legislation for Birth Control. This committee fought for it to become legal for doctors to freely distribute birth control. Finally, in 1936, the U.S. Court of Appeals made it legal for birth control and other means of contraception to be imported into the United States. Everything that she did, it helped women throughout the 1900s, and it's still currently helping women of today have a say when or if they are to become mothers, which was something that Margaret really strongly believed in, something that she fought for. Okay, now for Dorothea Dix. Her contribution to mental health care, and more specifically, how she made an impact on women's mental health care. So at age 39, she began a career teaching a Sunday school for women at the jail of East Cambridge, Massachusetts. While she was there, she witnessed all of these women. They were locked together regardless of their criminal record, regardless of their sobriety or their mental state. They were neglected, they had no heat, they had no light, they had very little clothing, and they didn't have sanitary facilities. So she began her research immediately, and in 1843, she created a memorial to be presented to the state legislature, except that during the time, women were not allowed to even be near a state house. So she had a friend present it in her place. Her convictions were so powerful that her memorial immediately went over the legislature, and they had funds put aside to expand the Worcester State Mental Hospital. Dorothy Dix felt so strongly for the care of the mentally ill that even when she became really physically ill, she still traveled, and in the end, she contributed to the founding of 32 mental hospitals, 15 schools for the feebly minded, a school for the blind. She helped put libraries in prisons. She helped build mental hospitals so that the mentally ill weren't having to be put in prisons. She also made many training facilities for nurses. We'll touch up on her role with nurses a little bit later. So Dorothea was one of the most politically active women of her generation, and it made her a leader for young women activists. So now I'm going to touch up on her role with nurses. So later down the road, when she was almost 60, she was appointed to be the superintendent of the Army nurses by the Union Army. So while she was there, she hired many female nurses, and but because they were female, she took into account the male presence in the hospitals and conducted hiring based on unflattering attributes and dress codes because she was fearful of the male doctors and the patients exploiting her nurses in the hospitals. Many of the male doctors and surgeons didn't like having female nurses around, and they fought with Dorothea Dix until the War Department got involved. But they sided with Dorothea and granted her and the general surgeon the right to appoint female nurses. So to wrap all this up, I admire Dorothea because not only was she heavily involved in politics and she made so many changes during the mid-1800s, but she did it all while being a woman during such a misogynistic time. She is a great role model, and I believe she helped a lot of women in that time gain courage to stand up for what they really believed in. Dorothea fought for the mentally ill to be treated humanely, and she didn't let laws against women's participation in politics get in the way. Both her and Margaret Sanger played a huge role in women's lives during their time, and she shaped how females can participate in the world today.